At my brother's celebration dinner, my mother lifted her glass, called every name with pride, then stopped at mine and let the silence burn. I drove home with her words lodged in my chest, turned them into the first line of a song, and within weeks, millions were singing. The very insult meant to break me, forcing the same faces that once looked past me to watch as I stood under the lights they swore I'd never earn. June evenings in Seattle have a way of trapping the last bits of sunlight, stretching them across the sky like they are reluctant to let go. I stood in my brother's driveway for a moment, smoothing down the navy dress I had borrowed from a consignment shop, before stepping into the warm glow spilling from his open front door. The laughter reached me first, mingling with the scent of rosemary roast and wine. Inside Tom's dining room table was set like a magazine spread, 12 seats around a polished oak table, gold-rimmed glasses catching the light. I slid into my chair near the end between an aunt I barely knew and a cousin who was already checking her phone. Dinner started with the usual clinking of silverware and passing of dishes, conversations overlapping in a practiced rhythm. Tom, looking every inch the golden sun in his tailored suit, despite being in his own house, was talking about the expansion campaign at his marketing firm. Mom sat at the head of the table, chin lifted slightly, her eyes following every word he said, as if the air itself was charged with his success. I kept my gaze on my plate, pushing around roasted carrots, waiting for my turn to speak, though I knew deep down it probably wouldn't come. When the plates were half empty, Mom stood raising her glass. The chatter quieted. She smiled at Tom, then at Emily, my younger cousin, who had just been accepted to med school, then at Aunt Carol for her charity work. Her voice was steady, proud, and clear. She told each of them she was proud, her eyes softening as she spoke. When her gaze landed on me, there was a pause. The smile thinned, but her tone stayed deceptively gentle. She said she was proud of everyone at this table, except me. The words landed with a strange stillness. I heard the soft scrape of a fork against porcelain somewhere down the table, and I felt every eye flick toward me before darting away. My chest tightened, but I kept my face composed, a small, polite curve of the lips that could pass for a smile. I said I understood, my voice low enough that it could have been mistaken for agreement. The air felt heavier, the clink of glasses almost too loud now. I excused myself, sliding my chair back slowly so it didn't screech against the hardwood. The hallway to the back deck smelled faintly of cedar from the board's cooler air rushing in as I opened the door. Out there, the street lamps were flickering on, and I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the highway a few blocks away. I gripped the railing, letting the cool wood ground me, inhaling until my shoulders dropped back into place. The sliding door opened behind me. Tom stepped out, still holding his wineglass. He leaned casually against the rail, his posture that of someone who has never doubted their place in the world. He said Mom didn't mean it like that she just wanted to push me towards something stable. Then he slipped a cream envelope from his blazer pocket, pressing it into my hand. It was from their company, he said. A grant of sorts to fund his side brand, an outdoor lifestyle label he had been dreaming about. He mentioned it as if it were just another piece of good news I should be happy for. He glanced at me, waiting for me to say something, maybe congratulations. Instead, I tucked the envelope back into his hand and told him to make it count. His brow furrowed for a second, but he didn't push. He told me not to be stubborn about music, that there were easier ways to make a life. I let the silence grow until it was thick between us. Back inside, the laughter had returned, though a little more forced now. I slipped my coat from the back of my chair and said my goodbyes without breaking stride toward the door. The night air outside was sharper, cooler, almost a relief. As I drove south toward Portland, the city lights receded into darkness, and my phone buzzed with messages. Little bursts of empty encouragement from people who had sat and watched. I deleted them one by one until the screen was blank. The road stretched ahead, long and quiet, and I let it carry me away from all of it. By the time I pulled into Portland, the sky was a flat gray, the kind that made the whole city look like it was painted in muted watercolors. I parked outside my apartment building, a squat brick structure wedged between a laundromat and a secondhand bookstore, and hauled myself up the narrow stairwell. The faint smell of burnt coffee and detergent followed me into my unit. The alarm went off at 5 the next morning, though I had barely slept. I pulled on my worn jeans and the black polo with the 7th Street Brew logo stitched in white. The walk to the cafe was quiet, the streets still damp from overnight rain. Inside, the place was warm, the air thick with the smell of espresso and baked goods. Linda, the owner, was already behind the counter, arranging muffins in the display case. She greeted me with her usual mix of warmth and brisk efficiency, then reminded me not to forget my Thursday night acoustic slot. I nodded, though part of me wanted to skip it altogether. The morning rush came in waves, and by 2 in the afternoon my hands smelled faintly of coffee grounds and sanitizer. I clocked out, grabbed a day-old croissant from the counter, and made my way home. The living room was dim except for the glow from Evelyn's laptop. She sat cross-legged on the floor, headphones half off, tweaking levels on our hollow-light session. Cables curled across the carpet like lazy snakes. Caleb was there too, setting up his DSLR on a tripod, testing angles for a live video. He looked up when I walked in, gave a small salute with his camera, then went back to adjusting the frame. Evelyn pulled off her headphones and asked if I was ready to record again. I told her I needed a minute. I dropped my bag, opened my banking app out of habit, and felt my stomach sink at the number staring back at me. $428 left after rent, and it was only the second week of the month. Evelyn was still talking about reverb tales when my phone buzzed with an email from the building manager. The rent was going up 7% in August. I stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. She noticed my expression and asked what was wrong. I told her, and she swore under her breath, then said we just had to finish this song and get it out there. I walked over to the mic stand in the corner, brushing my fingers along the pop filter. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old takeout and the faint metallic tang of the recording gear. Caleb suggested we shoot a stripped-down take tonight, just me, the guitar, and the first verse. Evelyn agreed, saying it might capture something more raw. We worked for hours, stopping and starting, me stumbling over a phrase, her stopping to adjust EQ, him asking me to tilt my head slightly toward the light. Between takes, I sipped lukewarm tea, my throat tightening with each attempt to make the words feel as sharp as they had in my head. When we finally called it, the clock read just past midnight. Caleb packed up his gear, promising to send me some still frames for socials. Evelyn saved the session and closed her laptop, her hair falling into her eyes as she leaned back against the couch. She asked if I was scared. I told her I was more afraid of staying exactly where I was than of failing. The apartment was quiet after they left. I sat on the edge of the couch, the city humming faintly outside the window, the email about the rent still open on my phone. The song needed to be finished, but more than that, it needed to matter. I let that thought settle in my chest, like a weight steady and unyielding. I stared at the muted glow from the street lamp outside my window, watching it flicker slightly against the rain-specked glass. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment, a steady drone that left too much space for old memories to slip in. They always seemed to come when I was tired, when the edges of the present blurred just enough to let the past seep through. I was 19 when everything shifted. Dad had been gone less than a year, and the house in Tacoma had already lost the warmth it used to hold. Mom's voice became the metronome of the household, sharp and constant, dictating what was done, what was said, and what was worth doing. Tom was already interning at a marketing firm in the city, and every conversation seemed to orbit his achievements. She called him the family's anchor, the one who would carry us forward. I learned quickly to disappear into my room, guitar on my lap, letting the notes ring out quietly enough not to draw attention. From 2012 to 2016, I did what was expected of me, at least on paper. I enrolled at Oregon State University, majoring in communications because it sounded stable and respectable, 2 words my mother prized more than anything. I smiled through holidays, wore the clothes she bought me, and nodded at advice I had no intention of following. In my final year, I walked into my academic advisor's office with a form in hand, signed it, and walked out no longer a student. I told myself it was a temporary break, that I would come back once I'd proven myself in music. Deep down, I knew I wouldn't. Every trip home after that felt like walking into a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. She would ask if I had thought about real work yet, and then, without waiting for my answer, turn to Tom to ask about his latest campaign or bonus. I became background noise in my own family. The family albums told the same story more permanently. Every Christmas photo, every summer barbecue, every birthday lined up like little exhibits in a museum of other people's successes. Tom was always at the center, framed perfectly with hands on his shoulders or arms around him. I was there too, but at the edges slightly out of focus or turned at the wrong moment. My smile when it appeared looked like it had been pulled out of me by force. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me out of the thought. A text from Mom. She wrote that there was a family lunch this weekend and that I should come. There was someone she wanted me to meet, a woman named Susan from her church, who was looking for an administrative assistant at her office. It was steady work, she said, with benefits and a path to something stable. She added a line about how I could use something solid right now, given how unpredictable the music thing could be. I typed out a reply. I'm not taking a job just to hide from my dream. I stared at it for a long time, the words almost daring me to send them. Then I deleted it. I knew how the conversation would go, how it would end with her sighing into the phone telling me she was just trying to help, and me biting my tongue until it ached. The apartment door opened, and Evelyn came in, a grocery bag dangling from her wrist. She set it down on the coffee table and pulled out a bag of kettle chips and 2 cans of soda. She sank into the couch opposite me and studied my face. "What's up?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. I told her about the text. She smiled, not out of humor, but in that way you do when something is both unsurprising and exhausting. She said, "They're never going to see it, not the way you want them to." I nodded, my fingers tracing the seam of the cushion beside me. After a moment, she leaned forward. "So what do you want?" "Not from them, but from this song." I looked at her, the question settling somewhere deeper than I expected. I told her I didn't need my family to approve. I needed 30 seconds, just the first 30 seconds that would make a stranger stop scrolling, that would cut through the noise and land like a blade. That was the only measure that mattered to me. Her eyes lit up a little, that glint she gets when she's already thinking about levels and mic placement. "We can do that," she said. "But you have to let it get personal." "It is personal," I said. "Not yet," she replied. The words hung between us. She pulled her laptop closer, opening the Hollow Lights project. The opening chords played softly through the studio monitors, filling the room with a kind of anticipation. I closed my eyes and listened. It was good, but it wasn't sharp enough. It didn't have the weight I wanted it to carry. In my head, I could hear the first line. Not just the words, but the way my voice would catch on them, the way the space between syllables could stretch just long enough to make someone lean closer. The image of that family dinner from last week sharpened in my mind, the glint of the wine glasses, the way my mother's gaze skimmed over me, the heat in my face when she skipped my name. That was where it had to start. Evelyn watched me with a kind of measured patience. I could tell she knew I was building something in my head. She didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence. "Caleb would be over tomorrow to help us shoot a test video," she said. "No rush, but when you're ready to put that line down, I'll be ready too." The hum of the refrigerator filled the space again. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the glow from the street lamp was steady now. I sat there still, as stone, feeling the shape of the song form in my chest, not just as music, but as an answer. An answer I had been holding back for years. The air in the apartment felt different that night, like it was holding its breath with me. Evelyn strung a line of warm white fairy lights across the curtain rod, their glow falling over the mic stand in the corner. She adjusted the pop filter, stepping back to check the height, then waved me over. I slipped the headphones on and listened to the click track in my right ear, the opening chords in my left. The guitar sounded clean, almost too clean, like it was waiting for something to disturb it. Take 17, and my voice was starting to feel the strain. The high notes caught in my throat, the softer ones faded too soon. Evelyn leaned over the laptop, watching the waveforms scroll by, then stopped the track mid-verse. She told me we were dragging it out too long, that the intro was eating into the moment where people decide to keep listening. "Cut it to 5 seconds," she said, "and hit them with the hook before they know what's coming." Caleb crouched by the tripod, camera lens pointed straight at me. He wanted to capture it in one take, no edits, just me and the guitar. I could feel the heat from the lights and the weight of his attention. He said it needed to feel like someone had walked in on me mid-thought. I played through again, fingers brushing the strings with more bite this time, but the words still felt like they were hovering just above the surface. Between takes, I checked my phone. Jared Cole's name was in my inbox, the subject line just demo. Evelyn's connection from North Coast Records, a marketing manager with a reputation for spotting songs that could travel fast online. I had sent him the rough cut last night, more out of curiosity than expectation. His reply was short. Hook's good. Mix feels thin. Not hearing the story point in the first 5 seconds. I read it twice, the words echoing louder each time. Not hearing the story point. Evelyn glanced at me and asked what he said. I handed her the phone. She read it once and nodded. He's right, she said. We're holding back the part that makes it yours. I knew exactly what she meant. It was the line I had been carrying around since that dinner, the one that sat in my chest like a stone. I took the guitar again, fingers finding the shape of the chord without thought. I said it out loud just to hear how it sounded in the room. At dinner, she was proud of everyone but me. Evelyn froze, then broke into a small smile. Keep it, she said, not as a lyric buried in the verse, as the first thing they hear. Like a confession. We tried it right then. Caleb hit record, the red light blinking in the corner of my vision. I spoke the line into the mic, letting the pause after it stretch for just a beat before sliding into the first chord. It changed the way the whole song felt. The guitar seemed to lean into the words, the melody sharper, the air heavier. We ran it again and again, experimenting with how much grit to let into my voice, how long to let the silence hang after the opening. Caleb adjusted the angle so the fairy lights framed me in soft focus, the edges of the room falling into shadow. On the final take, I closed my eyes on the last chorus, letting my voice push right to the edge of breaking. When we stopped, the room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the preamp. Evelyn hit play, and we listened, none of us speaking, until the last note faded. She looked at me and said it was the first time the song sounded like mine. Caleb packed his camera, saying we had something worth posting, maybe not perfect yet, but alive. It was past midnight when they left. I sat alone in the glow of the lights, the mic still standing where I had been, the words still lingering in the air. I didn't touch the laptop. I just let the silence settle, knowing the opening line was no longer just in my head. It was out here now, and there was no taking it back. The next morning started with rain, thin and constant, sliding down the glass in uneven trails. I sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the TikTok upload screen. The video Caleb had cut together was already cued, the thumbnail frozen on my face just after I said the line. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the trackpad, then clicked post. For the first hour, I checked the numbers every few minutes. 47 views, then 106. By lunchtime, it had reached just over 2,000. The comments were polite, mostly strangers saying they liked my voice, a few fire emojis. It was fine, but fine wouldn't break through the noise. That night, Evelyn came by with her laptop to help post the second clip, the one where I played the stripped-down acoustic version under the fairy lights. She thought it had more intimacy, something that might grab the algorithm. We scheduled it for peak engagement, which in our world meant 8 p.m. Pacific. I made tea while she adjusted captions and hashtags, our voices low as if the song might overhear us and change on its own. By the end of the week, we had 3 videos up. The numbers hovered stubbornly between 2,000 and 4,800. The analytics graph looked like a row of small hills that never climbed high enough to matter. Caleb told me to be patient, that it was a slow burn. Evelyn said the right share could change everything overnight. I nodded, but the truth was, I felt like I was standing still while the world moved past me. On Friday, during my lunch break at the cafe, I pulled out my phone and sent a direct message to Sophie Lane, an influencer I'd followed for years. She was 27, always posting golden hour covers in her perfect kitchen, the kind of content people saved and reposted without thinking. I kept it short, told her I admired her work, linked to my clip, and said I'd love to collaborate if she was open. I hit send before I could overthink it. 2 days later, the message showed as seen. No reply. Linda noticed me staring at my phone during my shift on Sunday. She handed me a latte, and when no one was looking, slipped a small white envelope into my palm. I opened it in the back room and found a tip she'd set aside from her own jar. She told me not to let my mother's version of success define the thing I loved. Her voice was steady, the kind that leaves no room for argument. I swallowed the lump in my throat and thanked her. When I got home, I logged into my bank account and saw the warning in red text weekly spending exceeded the limit. I clicked through to see the numbers laid out in cold precision: rent, utilities, groceries, gas. No extravagance, just survival, and still it was too much. That night I sat down to work on a new post. Evelyn suggested we isolate the confession line, just me saying it, no music over a close-up of my hands on the guitar. I was halfway through setting up the shot when my phone buzzed with a new notification. The comment was on the first video. Amber Reynolds. I hadn't thought about her in years, not since high school, when we were inseparable for 2 summers, before she drifted toward Tom's orbit during college breaks. She had a way of making every conversation feel like a secret, even when you knew you weren't in on the real one. Guess some dreams really do come cheap. I stared at it until the words blurred. Within an hour, replies stacked underneath. Little digs about coffee shop musicians, snide jokes about quitting school to play dress-up with a guitar. Some usernames were strangers. Others I recognized, an old classmate, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Each new notification felt like another shove between my shoulder blades. For a few minutes, I considered deleting the clip, wiping it from my profile like it had never existed. But the longer I looked at the thread, the calmer I felt. Not numb exactly, just a kind of cold stillness, like the air before a storm hits. When Evelyn called later, I told her about Amber's comment. She asked if I wanted her to report it. I said no. She was quiet for a moment, then asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going to post again. Something sharper, louder, impossible to laugh off. She said she'd be over in the morning. Caleb could make it too. If they were going to watch, I was going to give them something worth staring at. After I hung up, I sat in the half-light of the living room, the fairy light still strung across the curtain rod, the mic stand in the corner like it was waiting for me. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, tapping faintly against the glass. My fingers itched for the guitar, but I didn't touch it. Not yet. I wanted to let the pressure build just a little longer. Rain had been falling since before dawn, a steady mist that blurred the edges of everything on the road. I loaded the ring of old house keys into my bag, their weight a dull reminder of how long I had put this off. The tin of shortbread cookies sat on the passenger seat beside them, something small to hand over, so the visit wouldn't feel purely transactional. Seattle was 3 hours north, and I drove most of it in silence, letting the hiss of the wet asphalt under the tires fill the space where music would usually be. Pulling into my mother's neighborhood felt like entering a set that had been left untouched for years. The same trimmed hedges, the same white shutters, the same faint smell of wet cedar in the air. Extra cars were parked along the curb, the kind that looked like they belonged to people who knew how to network over cocktails. I recognized one from a photo Tom had posted recently, his colleague, the one with the tailored wool coat and sharp leather shoes. The front door was unlocked as always. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and slow-cooked meat layered over the faint trace of her perfume. I could hear her voice before I saw her pitched in that bright tone she used for guests, all warmth and polished charm. She was in the kitchen, glass of red wine in hand, speaking to a couple I didn't know. I lingered in the doorway unseen for a moment, listening as she recounted Tom's latest win. $40,000 in sponsorship funding for a campaign he was leading. She said it like it was proof of his inevitable rise, each dollar a stepping stone toward something grand. They laughed in that impressed, approving way that told me they'd already decided he was exceptional. When her eyes finally landed on me, her expression flickered surprise, then polite civility. She greeted me with a quick hello, not quite warm, but not cold enough to draw attention. She asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. I said I couldn't. My coat stayed on. I set the cookies on the counter beside the old keys. Her glance at them was quick, distracted, like she was already moving on to the next line in her story for the guests. As I turned toward the hallway, I caught her voice again this time, pitched lower but not low enough that I couldn't hear. "Stubborn," she said, still chasing music like it will ever be more than a phase. I didn't stop walking. In the front hallway, Emily appeared wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was 24 now, taller than I remembered, her hair pulled into a loose knot that left a few strands falling around her face. She handed me a small box of cookies wrapped in parchment, her eyes steady. "I believe in you," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came. I just nodded and stepped outside. The air was cool and damp, the pavement slick under my boots. The street lamps reflected off the wet asphalt, turning the whole block into a muted gold painting. I was halfway to my car when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a notification from Instagram. Amber Reynolds had posted a story and tagged me. Against my better judgment, I tapped it open. A photo of a latte art heart, the caption curling over it in cursive. "For the dreamers who drop out of school and end up making coffee." The tag on my name pulsed faintly in the corner. I stood still, the cold seeping into my gloves. There was no sting of surprise, just the slow, familiar tightening in my chest. Without thinking twice, I tapped through to her profile and hit block. The clean severing of the connection felt better than I expected, like shutting a door on a room that had been leaking heat. I leaned against the driver's side door, my breath misting in the air, and unlocked my phone again. This time, I opened the voice recorder. I spoke the lines slowly, letting each word land with the precision I'd been carrying in my head for weeks. At dinner, she was proud of everyone but me. The playback through the small speaker was colder than I expected, stripped of anything that might soften it. I listened twice, committing the shape of it to memory. Saving the file, I slid the phone back into my pocket and gripped the door handle. The keys were gone now, left behind on the counter, but the absence of their weight was heavy enough to follow me back to Portland. I started the car, the windshield wipers swiping in a steady rhythm as I pulled away from the curb. The city faded behind me, but the voice note stayed sharp in my mind, a small, perfect blade waiting for its moment. The apartment was dark when I walked in, the faint hum of the fridge greeting me like a reminder that nothing here had moved in my absence. Evelyn was already there, cross-legged on the couch with her laptop open, the glow from the screen lighting her face. She didn't ask how Seattle went. She just looked at me and said, "Let's cut it." We moved to the desk where the project file for Hollow Lights was still open from the last session. Evelyn dragged the waveform back, slicing off the guitar lead-in until only the barest click remained before my voice came in. 0.8 seconds. No room for anyone to scroll away before hearing the words. Caleb leaned over her shoulder, suggesting we keep the video in stark black and white, the subtitles in plain white text, with no shadow, raw enough that it felt unpolished but intentional. Evelyn typed the caption, "If your mom said this at dinner." By the time the export finished, it was past 1 in the morning. My hands were steady as I uploaded the clip, tagging it with just enough keywords to get caught in the right feeds. I watched the progress bar crawl to 100%, then pressed post. The time read 1:37 a.m. I set the phone face down on the coffee table. We didn't talk. Evelyn picked at a loose thread on her hoodie. Caleb scrolled through his camera roll, and I stared at the outline of the mic stand in the corner. 20 minutes later, I flipped the phone over. 18,700 views, 4,300 likes, 312 comments. My breath caught just for a second. Evelyn leaned in to see, then grinned without saying anything. Caleb let out a low whistle. I scrolled through the comments, my thumb almost trembling at the speed. People were quoting the line, tagging friends, stitching their videos to it. Some wrote about their own dinners, their skipped-over moments. Others just wrote, "Damn." Then a notification popped up that made me freeze. A large account with over 1 million followers had remixed the hook, looping my voice over a slow piano track. The video already had tens of thousands of likes and was climbing fast. Before I could process it, another ping came through. Sophie Lane had commented on my original post. "Using this now." I read it twice, my pulse quickening in my ears. Evelyn reached for the phone, saw the name, and gave me a sharp nod like she'd known this would happen. Caleb leaned back in his chair, both hands behind his head, smiling in that quiet, satisfied way he got when a shot landed better than expected. I didn't say anything. I just slid down onto the floor, my back against the couch, the phone balanced in my palm. My hands were shaking, but my eyes felt wide open, almost painfully awake. The room seemed sharper somehow, the hum of the fridge louder, the glow of the fairy lights clearer, the faint scratch of Evelyn's pen on a notepad as she jotted down ideas. The numbers kept climbing. 23,000 views, then 29. The comments came in faster, the screen updating every few seconds. Somewhere between the noise of notifications and the stillness of the early morning, I realized that the blade I had been carrying was no longer just in my pocket. It was out there, and people were picking it up. By noon the next day, the counter had passed 500,000 views. My phone was warm from the constant stream of notifications, the battery draining faster than the charger could keep up. The comments section had become a small city of its own people, weaving in and out of each other's stories, quoting my line like it belonged to them. By the 24-hour mark, the number had doubled and doubled again, until it hit 2 million. My DMs were a flood: producers, singers, journalists, people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly remembering my number. Some wanted collaborations, others wanted to talk about representation, licensing, and interviews. I ignored most of them, just skimming for the ones that mattered. The call from Jared came just after 3 in the afternoon. His voice was sharper than usual, all business. He told me not to sign anything, not even to answer the bigger accounts who were asking to use the track. He said he was setting up a call with Richard Dawson, an entertainment lawyer in Los Angeles, who handled rights and royalties for half the names in the Spotify charts. I wrote the name down on a yellow sticky note and stuck it to my laptop, the ink pressing deep into the paper. When I checked Spotify that night, Hollow Lights, Claire Whitman, and Evelyn Park had appeared on the viral 50. It was near the bottom, number 49, but it was there. Seeing our names in that list felt like watching a door swing open somewhere I had never been invited before. Evelyn sent a screenshot with no caption, just the green heart emoji. 2 days later, Linda pulled me aside during my morning shift. She said she wanted to host a small showcase at the cafe that weekend. Nothing fancy, just me, Evelyn, a borrowed amp, and an audience that had been forming in her head since Sophie Lane's remix went live. By the time Saturday came, there was a line outside the door. People carried their phones like tickets, showing the clip to each other while they waited. I saw more than one person wearing merch from Sophie's brand. Under the warm glow of the cafe lights, I played the song straight through, no changes, the confession line hitting the room like it always did. The space was too small for the sound to travel, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Every face was turned toward me, listening. Later that night, as I was closing my guitar case, my phone buzzed with a new message request. It was from Amber. "Looks like luck finally decided to smile on you." Beneath the text was a link to an article. I almost didn't click it, but curiosity got the better of me. A local music blog had run a piece on the song's sudden rise, tying it to Sophie Lane's post, the viral remix, and a string of user-generated videos quoting the opening line. My name was in the headline. Further down, I saw it again, bolded in the section about trending topics. I leaned back in my chair, letting the screen dim in my hand. The numbers were one thing, the press another. But this was proof that the story had left the tight circle I'd been trapped in for years. The fight had just shifted into something bigger, and I was ready for it. The email from North Coast landed in my inbox just after 8 on Monday morning. I was still in bed, half awake, the light through the blinds thin and gray. The subject line read, "Draft Agreement, Hollow Lights." My stomach tightened before I even clicked. The PDF was 13 pages. Buried in the legal language was the advance offer, $25,000, and a clause that made me sit up straight. Single option rights to the track, work for hire designation, sole authorship under my name. Evelyn's name was nowhere. I called Richard Dawson before I even poured coffee. He answered on the second ring, already sounding like he knew what I was going to say. He explained the risks in measured tones. If I signed as is, the song would legally belong to the label. Evelyn's contribution would be erased on paper, no royalties, no credit. Work for hire meant they could use it, remix it, or even re-record it without me having a say. When Evelyn came by that afternoon, I showed her the clause. She read it twice, then pushed the laptop back toward me. "If keeping me on means you lose the deal, I'll step back," she said quietly. I stared at her for a long moment, the noise of the city leaking in through the open window. "If keeping the deal means you lose credit?" "I'm walking away," I said. Her mouth tightened, but her eyes softened. We didn't need to say more. That night I got a DM from Ben Carter, a journalist whose bylines I recognized from long-form profiles in music magazines. He said he wanted to do a feature about being overlooked, underestimated, and then breaking through. His words. I told him I'd think about it. The next morning I drafted an email back to North Coast. I asked for specific revisions Evelyn listed as a co-writer. 50-50 publishing split on the songwriting clear division of master rights and no work-for-hire designation. I read it over 3 times, each sentence sharp but not emotional, and sent it to Jared to forward. Then the waiting began. 24 hours. 36. 48. No reply. My inbox was a quiet screen, but the rest of the internet wasn't. Amber posted on her feed. A photo of her in a studio captioned about how some people are impossible to collaborate with because they think their little moment means they can dictate terms. She didn't tag me, but she didn't have to. Mutual friends liked it, and the comments were filled with vague affirmations. The implication was enough. By evening, a few messages in my DMs hinted at it. Was it true I was difficult? That I'd walked away from a label offer because I couldn't share? I ignored them, but each one felt like a grain of sand in my shoe. Small, persistent, impossible to forget. Evelyn came over with Thai takeout and a bottle of red wine. We ate on the floor, the contract draft printed out between us. I traced my finger over the lines that needed to change the places where her name belonged. We talked through scenarios. What if they said yes? What if they walked? What if they countered with something just close enough to tempt us? By midnight, we still hadn't heard a thing. The city outside was quiet, a faint hum from the street lamps the only sound. I folded the contract and slid it into my bag. The silence from North Coast was starting to feel like a strategy, and I was already deciding how to answer it. The call from Richard came just after 9 in the morning. His voice was measured, but I could hear the shift in his tone before he said the number. A team representing Grace Thompson wanted to buy the exclusive rights to Hollow Lights, $350,000 up front. My share would be credited as additional lyrics. Evelyn's name would be gone. They wanted the master, too. Grace would re-record it, adjust the structure, tailor it for the market, as they put it. Richard laid it out plainly. A life-changing sum, but no control, no ownership, no way back once I signed. I asked him to set a meeting. 2 days later, I was in Los Angeles, sitting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city haze. Grace arrived with her publicist and 2 assistants. She was effortlessly charismatic, the kind of person who could make you forget your name if you weren't paying attention. She talked about how she could take the song places I couldn't. Bigger playlists, bigger stages, a bigger story. She said it deserved to be in the hands of someone who could handle the weight of it. I listened without interrupting. She painted the picture of a career trajectory like it was an elevator I could step into. But every version of that picture had my name in fine print, or not at all. When she was finished, I thanked her for the offer and told her I was keeping the song. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes shifted just slightly, as if she'd already moved on to the next opportunity. Back in Portland that night, I found an email from North Coast waiting in my inbox. Their silence had been broken in the form of a new offer. The terms were closer to what I'd asked for. Evelyn listed as co-writer a publishing split, but there were caveats buried in the language, and they wanted my signature within 24 hours. As I was reading it, Jared called. His voice was clipped. "If you don't take this, the label will pull all promotional support. That means no playlist pushes, no press outreach, no ad spend. Everything we've built in the last month will slow to a crawl." I stared at the email on my laptop, the cursor blinking in the reply box. The 2 conversations, Grace in her glass tower and Jared on the phone, twisted together in my head. One was a door I'd closed, the other a door that was closing on me. Outside, the street was washed in the orange light of the setting sun. I could hear Evelyn in the other room, her guitar picking out the intro we'd cut down to less than a second. The same second that had turned everything upside down. The clock on my desk read 6:42 p.m. The deadline wasn't until tomorrow morning, but the weight of it pressed in like it had already arrived. The email from Carson Reed's producer came just before midnight. They wanted me on the show the following week performing live. It would be my first national television appearance. I read the message twice, then sent it to Evelyn with nothing but a question mark. She called immediately, her voice sharp with disbelief that quickly turned into planning. In the days leading up to it, the hashtag #KeepTheCredits began circulating online. Fans, smaller artists, even a few industry names posted about protecting co-writer recognition. The noise was loud enough that North Coast called Jared. By the next morning, they had agreed to amend the contract. Evelyn's name would stay. Our publishing split would be honored. The day of the show, the studio was colder than I expected, the air sharp with the smell of stage lights and hairspray. Crew members moved like clockwork, adjusting cameras, taping down cables, murmuring into headsets. Backstage, I could hear the muffled applause from the segment before mine. My hands were trembling enough that I had to set down the water bottle I was holding. Evelyn stood in front of me, her hands warm as they gripped my wrist. "Just sing the first line like you're standing on your mom's porch," she said. "The rest will follow." I had invited Emily, and she was somewhere in the audience. Linda had flown in that morning and was sitting a few rows back from the stage. Tom had texted earlier. "Good luck. No punctuation." My mother hadn't replied to the message I sent. When they called my name, the stage lights hit so hard I had to blink against the glare. Carson greeted me with that smooth, practiced warmth he was known for, and after the applause faded, he asked about the story behind the song. I didn't give the full version. I told a short, distilled piece of it, a family dinner, a single sentence, the kind of silence that stays long after the plates are cleared. Then the band counted in, and I sang. The first line left my mouth exactly the way it had in Evelyn's living room, sharp and steady. The rest of the song moved on its own, each word finding its place in the air. When I finished, the audience rose, the sound of their clapping rolling over me like a wave. Carson leaned forward in his chair. "If you could send a message to anyone right now, who would it be?" I looked straight ahead into the camera. "To the person who taught me that silence is also an answer," I said. The words hung there for a moment before the show moved to commercial. The next morning, Hollow Lights had climbed into the top 30 on iTunes. My inbox was stacked with interview requests, and Jared said we could fill 3 straight weeks without taking a break. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, watching the numbers move. The song had become more than a line, more than a moment. It was a stage I had built myself, and I knew exactly who had been watching. By the spring of 2024, Hollow Lights had passed 50 million streams. The number didn't feel real until the royalty statement came in pages of clean black type, translating listens into something I could hold in my hand. I signed the lease on a small studio space in Portland, big enough for 2 desks, a vocal booth, and the old couch Evelyn insisted on bringing from her apartment. With Linda and Richard, I set up a mini grant program, $10,000 a year, for young female producers. We kept the applications simple, the decisions unanimous. The first award went to a 19-year-old from Minneapolis, who mixed tracks in her dorm closet. Watching her reaction on the video call felt like looking at a door swing open. Jared walked us through the final steps of locking down publishing administration. Evelyn and I would control the flow of our own royalties. No middlemen to lose things in translation, no quiet reassignments buried in paperwork. We signed the documents in the studio with Caleb filming on his phone. Then came the kind of full-circle moment you can't plan for. An ad agency had used 8 seconds of Hollow Lights in a campaign for a sportswear company my brother worked with. The audio was unlicensed. Richard sent a DMCA notice before I even knew about it. The agency pulled the ad and issued a public apology. A day later, Tom texted. "I didn't know." I wrote back, "I believe you." In early summer, I agreed to meet my mother at a cafe near Green Lake. She arrived 10 minutes early wearing the same silver watch she'd had for years. We ordered coffee, talked about the weather, the grant program, a few things that didn't matter much. Then she said she had been wrong in how she expressed herself that night at dinner. I told her I had learned how to understand silence. We didn't hug. We didn't pretend to rewrite what had happened. We just left the table with the boundaries intact. Ben Carter's follow-up article came out that fall. It wasn't framed as a Cinderella story. It was about copyright self-respect and the way small decisions can redraw the map of a life. He quoted me exactly once, something I'd said without thinking during our interview. "You don't have to win everyone over. You just have to stop giving them the pen." That night I stayed in the studio working on a new song. Evelyn was sitting cross-legged on the couch, laughing over a strange chord progression I'd stumbled into. Caleb had rehung the photo from our first recording night, the one where the mic stand leaned at a slight angle and my hair was pulled back with a pencil. In the corner of the room sat an old wooden chair. For years it had been the seat I imagined saving for a compliment that never came. I walked over, picked it up, and carried it to the storage closet. The space it left behind was small, but it felt clean. If you've ever been told you're not enough, tell your story. Here we decide the measure for ourselves. And when the light shifts, we make sure there's room for everyone to stand in it.